was the shyest man alive and hated to have go among strangers or to any place where he might have to talk. Matthew, dressed up with a collar and driving in a buggy, he was something that didn't happen often. Mrs. Rachel pondered as she might could make nothing out of it. I'm s- Mrs. Rachel pondered as she might could make nothing of it, and her afternoon's enjoyment was spoiled. I'll just step over to the Green Gables after tea and find out from Marilla where he is gone and why. The worthy woman finally concluded. He doesn't generally go to town this time of year. He never visits if he'd run out of turnip seed. He wouldn't dress up and take the buggy to go for more. He wasn't driving fast enough to be going for a doctor. Yet something must have happened since last night to start him off. I'm clean puzzled. That's what and I won't know a minute's peace of mind or conscience until I know that has taken me which seemed to her dancing and irresponsible a thing for a word which was meant to be taken seriously. And here she sat now, knitting, and the table behind her was laid for supper. Mrs. Rachel, before she had fairly closed the door, had taken a mental note of everything that was on the table. There were 3 plates laid, so that Marilla must be expecting someone home with Matthew to eat tea. But the dishes were everyday dishes, and there was